Welcome to another Sunday Superversive Livestream. I am your host, Ben Wheeler, and I'm joined by Anthony Marquetta, the magnificent, the lovely, the glorious. Anthony, how are you doing today?
My favorite title was The Lovely.
Mm. So today we're doing a great man stream. I don't have slides or anything, but because I'm going to mostly be talking about dead astronauts, but I'll also be talking about Magellan in there somewhere. And Anthony will be talking about the great Korean general Yi Sun Sen, who is a man worthy of respect, both for his naval strategy and for his personal character. Magellan, however, is a much more fun and colorful character in his own way, but also one who's worthy of talking about in
Yeah,
some detail, especially in the sort of age of non-exploration that we find ourselves in. We lose the spirit of what men like Magellan, men like Yi Sun Sen, sort of mean to their country. Whereas Yi Sun Sen, I don't think he ever even made it past, several hundred miles past Korea's, um, sea borders, shoreline. Magellan circumnavigated the world, or his crew did. Uh, he unfortunately perished in the Philippines, roughly half, two thirds, five eighths of the way through his voyage. And you might say to yourself, why should that make a man great? Why should exploration and technically, since he died, a failed exploration, make him worthy of discussion? Well, there's a lot to him. Some of it's quite simple. His family life was actually quite simple. He was a minor noble. He was well off. His family was well off, and he worked um, as a sailor. He did his due work at an early age and continued on for the rest of his life. He was inspired by Christopher Columbus's successful voyages, as well as the rich profits that were brought in. Even though he was Portuguese, the Portuguese were often hired by the Spanish to open up certain areas of the world through, sailing their ships into it. Uh, you might be like, well, he was like, what, 40? 39, 37 when this got started. I forget what, you know, and you're glossing over, a 20 plus year career as a sailor. Well, it's honestly not really that important. A lot of what he did was sailing. He went through the conquest of Malacca. He was promoted, given plunder. He had this, he had that. But then when he returned to Portugal after his many adventures, he was. I don't think he was a proper conquistador the same way, but the same way like men like Hernan Cortez were. But he was certainly, of that same adventurous spirit. The conquistadors were often impoverished nobles. Magellan, not so much. In fact, from reading his life, you'll see that he never really suffered the same financial hardship that many other people we might talk about did throughout their lives. Instead, he suffered the deprivations of adventure, of exploration, and he came away quite profitable from it, even after he was sort of kicked out of Portugal by King Manuel. Uh, he still found plenty of work and labor in Spain, which led to the expedition that holds his name. The reason why I find him interesting, more so because of his adventure and then death, than for any immense character beyond his bravery is that he represents the spirit, the Faustian spirit of pursuing the goal as far as we're allowed to take it. Um, and with this regard, he completely, disregarded his safety. Yeah, he wore armor. Yeah, he killed people, but he did not regard parts of this life to be too precious to leave alone and not be, you know, filled with the adventure and glory of what's to come, and of course, the profit that comes with it. Uh, we could do to have more Magellans in our ranks, who are more than willing to, take on these great adventures, great feats. When he circumnavigated the world, he experienced many troubles. He went through them one at a time and took care of them, from the funding, from the charts, from the five fleets, the Trinidad, the Sant Antonio, the Concepcion, the Santiago, and the Victoria, uh, along with 270 men from many nations from across the world. Uh, you see this sort of like on the surface international, but really Spain led um, expedition that had the goal of, yeah, finding the Spice Islands, but also to complete what had been brewing for the last 100 years since Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal. The earth must be circumnavigated, the earth must be conquered. And you need men who are not afraid of these things to do it. One of the things that people bring up is, dead astronauts. We don't want to go to the moon because astronauts might die. We don't want people to have, to go up into space because a lot of death can take place. And yes, space is difficult. Some parts of our technology just does not matter once you get to the magnetosphere that's surrounding Earth and the Moon. Uh, there are radiation belts that will kill people to go through, and many other things besides. Stupidity will get you killed and bring failure to your expedition. In fact, we see this quite often. He was a part of a couple expeditions that kind of failed because of intrigue and the usual Spanish temper. But then we also look at things like conquistadors, I think it was Colorado's um, uh, expedition, or Coronado, I think, expedition into what we would call the American Southwest, to find El Dorado and not finding it and dying horribly along the way, with only one or two survivors. To us, it seems quite silly, quite stupid. And that one, honestly, I can't defend it. I can't defend it at all. Like the natives took to lying to Spaniards because they knew they had such a lust for gold that they'd believe anything if you just told them where El Dorado was. And they were often crazy enough to believe it too. So you go through it. You look at Magellan, his adventures, his uh, he created these temporary settlements over the world. He defeated mutinies. He killed their leadership and marooned a whole bunch of them, even priests, for their mutiny. Um, there's there's a lot here that he went through. Uh, and much of it was just the dreary days of sailing through the empty vastness of the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean is very, very, very empty. If you lose your temper or your uh, stamina, your mental stamina, you will die horribly. The mental fortitude it takes to get even as far as the Philippines, where Magellan died, required an iron will at the till to keep things going through. When it comes to our times, we do not have that will. We do not wish to look at examples like Magellan because, he perished. But in reality, we are going to need, and I hope it doesn't come to this, but we will have a lot more dead astronauts on our hands in the process of leaving the Earth's sphere. Again, I hope we don't have any dead astronauts. But it's likely in the course of adventure we will have dead astronauts. The astronauts themselves understand this. They understand that they are taking their lives into their hands by going up into space and pursuing that frontier dream that all Americans have. In the same way, Magellan knew that one wrong move and this is a one way trip. There were places and routes that were planned out that he knew. He knew all the charts. He had talked to all the right people, but he still had to face that unknown. The unknown between Spain and Tierra del Fuego and to the Philippines. Yes, people had been to the tip and a few other places before, but none had been willing to just throw themselves into the Pacific Ocean the same way that he had. When he came to the Philippines, he found allies and enemies, and his hosts, the Raja, became Christian. They were given gifts. I believe they were Christian previous to this. Let me see here. Let me just double check this. It doesn't really say when. But essentially, Magellan, he made a mistake. And that's the best way to put it. He was drawn into the local power squabbles in Asia. Now, Princess Bride, never get involved in a land war in Asia. That's not the right voice, I'm sorry. But, he got involved in a land war in Asia, in this case, the Philippines. A group didn't want to Christianize, and so they were convinced, the Magellan was convinced to fight them, and he died fighting them. They were overwhelmed and outnumbered, and they focused on him so that he was overwhelmed and killed. They said this of him. This is a long sentence. That caused the captain, Magellan, to fall face downward, when immediately they rushed upon him with iron and bamboo spears and with their cutlasses until they killed our mirror, our light, our comfort, and our true guide. When they wounded him, he turned back many times to see whether we were all in the boats. Thereupon, beholding him dead, we, wounded, retreated as best we could to the boats which were already pulling out. From the details of his journey. So then, without this captain, without the men that they had lost on this battle, the remaining people, including his steward, who I believe became the next proper leader, or at least was the leader by the time they came into Spain, loaded themselves up to 2 boats, and hello Bradford, continued on. Eventually they did succeed. I can't imagine. They reached the Spice Islands. Uh, they traded. They had all kinds of things. Um, but unfortunately, in the end, all they had is one ship left. One ship left. 18 men out of the original 237. These men had fought with Magellan. To Many of them had died with Magellan, and only 18 remained. They remained loyal to the vision. They remained loyal to the mission. That in itself is as great a heroism as Magellan planning out and launching this mission, not because of some sort of weird populist will of the people or whatever, but because of how Magellan pursued uh, his his dream, his goals. Even though he perished in the attempt, they were able to complete them. That in itself speaks greatly of greatness. That speaks of the iron will it took to get this going, to be communicated to these men, many of whom, they were experienced sailors, but you can't say they were educated in the same way that Magellan, being a uh, uh, noble, was educated, uh, minor or not. Some people say a lot of these, guys, especially the minor nobles, couldn't read and weren't educated. It's like, no, they were at least educated in military strategy, but they were certainly given more. Uh, how do I want to put it? No, they gave more of themselves to complete what Magellan set down, over the crews of many other ships. Uh, Mutiny that he experienced early on aside, once Magellan was dead, they did not mutiny again. But it seems like Christopher Columbus was always having to fight with his crew over anything, anything at all. Other times, I hear of great adventurers who, you know, never succeeded because their crew essentially refused to do the hard work and labor, but refused also to be mutinous. So that they were just kind of there, lumping thing, dragging them down. You also see other men who had a crew that was much stronger than them, and so they rode on them. But when it came time for my uh, that were much stronger than them, especially among the conquistadors. But when it came time to separate out the loot and booty and to actually make something of the land that they conquered, they instead scattered to the winds for more loot and booty. Um, the lessons that I keep coming back to are twofold. One, that exploration requires an incredibly strong will to complete. And Magellan clearly shows that will in the anecdotes of his life, both because he was willing to do things like feud with the ruler of Portugal. He was also willing to participate in many different expeditions before his major one, and also that he was willing, even after that feud, to pick himself up and immediately go and seek out more adventure. This man had a lust to dominate the world in this sort of explorer, adventurer, plunderer, piratic sort of way. Even though I would not call him a pirate, he has this piratic, grasping spirit that shows itself throughout his choices and actions. He didn't have to help the Christian king, he could just say, look, we're just here to trade, help you out, give you some gifts. We can't help you fight your war, and then move on. Instead, he smelt plunder. He smelt greatness. That taking this would, in fact, um, increase his glory in its own way. And I don't want to say glory. I mean glory like a soldier from the Iliad, who is vicious and strong in war, um, beautiful in its own way, but also at the same time still willing to be that soldier. Excuse me. Um, Coming back to our times. That was the first lesson. The second lesson is that great things require great sacrifices. Sometimes men and women are destroyed on the things that they're destroyed on the things that they achieve. Mary Curie is one everyone likes to trot out on women's days and months and stuff like that as the woman scientist, but she still, excuse me, sacrificed her life for her vision. There's a story of these girls who worked with radium, and what they would do is that they would take the radium and rub it on their teeth and give themselves this sort of like greenish glowing smile in the dark. Very striking, I'm sure. But then, when the radiation sickness came in, they found that their bones, their jawbones, were rotted, and could be removed without much issue. The whatever Mary Curie, um, suffered, it wasn't to impress a boy at the dance hall. Maybe she had her husband, and her husband was also very, astute as a scientist. They were good team. But at the same time, um, she didn't like. I don't think they were like in the dance hall. Hey, I did something else with radium. That's pretty odd, isn't it? No, it's not. It's not a thing. Uh, some like Coronado pursued greed and glory into death. Certain death, obvious death. They had taken myth for fact, even though there was very little evidence for it beyond hearsay. Now, in that era, yeah, all they had was hearsay, all they had was legends, all they had was adventures, but they could they could have chosen a different path. Uh, you can't say the same thing about things like Mary Curie, but also things like dead astronauts. And I keep saying dead astronauts because specifically that is the thing that still hasn't been solved yet. As weird as it is to say, Everest is solved. There's bad luck and there's a ton of skill involved, but anybody with the physical ability, and that's a lot less people than you think, but you can train up for it. Anyone with the physical ability and the will for it can climb Mount Everest. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying anyone can do it if they train themselves for it and they have the physical ability. But then we counter that with, well, Ben, everyone who's dead on Everest, and there's a lot of people dead on Everest, died motivated. It's like, yeah, but there's the glory in summiting Everest is personal now. But the glory for those who did it first is forever. So if I just type in summiting Everest, just as an example. Let me see here. Doo-doo. First, I don't want to know the first woman who climbed Mount Everest. I don't care about that. What's wrong with you people? I'm trying to find it because I want to say Amundsen was the first one, but I don't think so. Why is it difficult to find the like? So the first one was a guy named Mesner, who did it solo, without uh, Hillary. There we go, Edmund Hillary. Edmund Hillary, who I should have remembered, but Edmund Hillary was the first one with a Sherpa to reach Mount Everest. Other people have died before them. Uh, oh, excuse me. They made a big deal about this Chinese team that went up the summit uh, through a side way that no one ever thinks about. And it's like, okay, cool. Uh, I'm not a big fan of Mount Everest in the same way other people are. But it's the same spirit for Edmund Hillary as it was Magellan. Something in them demanded that they conquer it. The Chinese team, quite frankly, was probably a demand by their government to do something new and unique and conquer it, and say that they were there too. Um, and again, to be clear, it's difficult, it's hard. There's a ton of things that can kill you, but they've got the route down. They've got what you need down. They have how many air tanks you need, where they're going to have a base summit, where they're going to put this and that. And, oh, and look, there's George. George has been thawed for the winter and continues to rot. Wave to George, who died on this mountain. Uh, then you also have things like, what's another good one? Because mountain climbing is always very impressive, but it's once the first person does it, it's like Amundsen in the North Pole, Amundsen in the South Pole. They pursued something beyond themselves and eventually died for it down at the South Pole. And even though, it's a tragic and horrible end, they still made a choice that me, Anthony, sorry for speaking for you, Anthony, but, I don't know if you're up for climbing Mount Everest or flinging yourself
Not
into
interested.
space. Yes. Not interested. I don't want to do it. Other people, they might say, "Oh, that'd be pretty cool," but like, let's say you said, "Look, in 1 year, I'm gonna lead a Mount Everest expedition and take you up there, but you gotta train for it." Are people really that dedicated to train their entire lives for it? No, they're not even gonna do it for a year. That's the reason why I look to men like Magellan, and even women like Mary Curie, as examples of pursuing their goals beyond the acceptable limit. Um, you might say, well, Mary Curie didn't know anything about radiation poisoning, uh, but people knew that certain things were poisonous from the beginning. There's legends of caves and other things where radium and other not radium. where radioactive material could be pulled on that they knew was haunted, could make men sick and kill them. There's plenty of legends of poisons. I don't think Mary Curie was completely non understanding that radium was harmless. Uh, at least like we know how harmful it is. I'm not going to claim she knew everything we knew, but the idea that she didn't know that there was danger, I don't think is anything anyone can say. She wasn't shocked. It was sad when she started dying, but it wasn't like shocking, like, oh my goodness, I thought this was the equivalent of cotton candy. Me oh my. In just the same way that Magellan, like, death in battle always comes as a shock, but I don't think he was unprepared to die in battle. I don't think he went into this mission saying, I'm going, there's no risk here. There's, no damage that's going to be done to my body. I'm not going to suffer anything or anything like that. I think he knew that there was an immense chance that he was going to perish. Uh, there's a decent amount of writing, including contemporary writing about his expedition. It's well worth reading. I know as a child, I certainly read it. Um, I never bought into, oh, we're going over the side of the ocean. Oh, no, I don't think people actually believe that. Partially because they were often finding the bones of the previous expeditions that they had thought that had fallen over the side of the sea or whatever dumb thing they were saying to each other. Sure, they could believe in sea monsters, but, quite frankly, it's perfectly reasonable to believe in sea monsters. Have you seen a whale? Those are easy ones. But, like, let's say a giant squid washes up on your beach. They do that sometimes. What are you going to do then? You're going to say, well, no, that's a peaceful herbivore. No, dude, like, your priest is the only literate person in the village. And he's never seen anything like it, and he thinks it's of the devil. Like, and I don't mean to insult priests here, but it's, not every priest was an academic like Aquinas or anything like that. Savonarola came from somewhere. Uh, you get these things and you see it, right? It's terrifying. It's scary. These are not like things like a cow, right? This doesn't look like a cow. This doesn't look like a pig. It doesn't look like anything you've seen except for maybe some other fish. And quite frankly, I don't think there's any like freshwater squid. The scary things of the world were present, were there. They knew the world was round. They knew that their world probably didn't end in a giant cliff that would throw them into the abyss and probably into hell. You know, they weren't scared of the silly things we say that they were scared of. They were scared that they'd be eaten by cannibals, if they were scared at all, because they had guns then. And in the same way, in our modern world, the life of Magellan teaches us that greatness often requires physical sacrifice of you, of others, of the things of this world. He could have lived in comfort after his last few rounds of plundering. He didn't. Instead, he left his wife and went on another adventure. Yep, that's all I got. Anthony, any questions?
Um, yeah. Here's an open-ended one you could dig into. What do you think of the character of Magellan? Is he somebody to admire or not? Because I've always had the impression of no.
So, in the sense of like, Was he a good man? No. He was fairly piratical. Quite frankly, if Spain hadn't picked up his contract, he would have moved on to Genoa, and then if Genoa hadn't taken him on, he would have moved on to the Turks or something. Like in the sense of like, was he a loyal soldier for Christendom and stuff like that? Was he a gentleman? Was he a good man in our conception of things? No. He was a man with the will and ability to bring, a circumnavigation of the globe to fruition, to find the Spice Islands, to trade, and to get an immense profit back. Uh, I don't really ever want to say whether somebody is good or bad in these things, because most of the people we're going to be talking about are hellbound. Magellan was supposedly a Christian in the Catholic sense of 15th century Spain, which, thanks to the Jesuits and others, honestly gives him a decent chance. But also, he was a pirate. He was a conquistador of a kind. Sorry, Portugal, not Spain. Uh, and he, and while, I can't say that he was, super nice or anything like that, he was the right man for the job. And quite frankly, that's much more important than, it's much more important than some of the things that I see people value. Um, for the simple reason that the Christian gentleness that is exhibited in our generation, and I mean Christian in scare quotes, quote unquote gentleness, quote unquote Christian, does not make us the adventurers who would damn everything and throw ourselves into space. In fact, I would say that things like morality only apply in the personal decisions, not the sort of adventure that Magellan took part in. I don't think that he would have said anything like, I'm worried how people will view my morality either. Um, it's it's pretty clear that he valued some things of Christianity. He didn't disrespect them. But again, fundamentally, the man had a freebooting spirit. He had a roving, adventurous soul. And that often means that they don't look into the morality of their actions in the same way we would.
So, what what's the lesson? I guess you would uh, actually let me try and sum it up from what you said here. So the lesson you would take away from Magellan is that although we might not, and we probably should not learn from his greed and perhaps his lack of respect for life,
Yep.
we can learn from his spirit of adventure and discovery. It's something that we've lost.
Yes. And some of the stuff with his lack of respect for life, the only way to deal with mutineers is to kill them. Abandon them, throw them
That
off the
actually
ship.
wasn't even. Oh yeah, that wasn't even what I was thinking. I was thinking
Oh.
lack of respect for his own life, actually,
Oh. You see,
which is
mm,
interesting, I suppose. But
yeah, to me that's part and parcel. Like if any astronaut says, "Oh, I'm really scared. I hope I come home." It's like, "Yes, we understand that you can be scared and that you want to come home, but you still got to get in the ship. You still gotta do what you need to do here." Did he look on the horde of these people who would kill him and go, "Oh no, I over, I bit off more than I can chew." Yeah, but he saved the life. he fought for the lives of his crew and was able to get some of them onto the boats, distracting the enemy enough that they escaped. Or maybe he got caught out and they abandoned him, and he's like, "Where are you guys?" That is also a reasonable interpretation of the events. Um, but
That's kind of funny.
I don't really think that's true though. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that like with these people, like well, the first one we did was of that I did was of Timon of Corinth. Um, he fought a guerrilla war in Sicily against Carthage for years, like 30 years or something ridiculous like that. And he won many rewards from it. And while everyone considered him virtuous in his own way, some of the stuff I didn't go over, like death rates and the dead bodies in certain battlefields that have been discovered, he threw his dead enemies in a ditch. Like, he killed them, he jumped them, he bushwhacked them. He ran hit and run campaigns. He made sure that he had every advantage. Like, there's a certain amount of morality I just am not willing to give to people. Um,
I get you.
Compared to some of these things, like, you know, look at Napoleon. Uh, not a Christian, or at least I've never seen evidence of him being a Christian. Had his affairs, had his things. Conquered most of Europe or tried to. Um, but also, he came from the French Revolution, and those people were evil, evil people. Uh, not that the monarchy and the state of Spain was, I mean, sorry, France was much better before then. But it's like Napoleon, for all his ambition, for all his lust to conquer, was a better leader than Robespierre and the directory that came before him, which was a collection of people who murdered Robespierre, who, of course, Robespierre murdered the king.
I get your
Um,
point. There's a certain context here that you need to keep in mind, and also, the fact that, as you mentioned, like there's a reminder too that we're not God as we
yep,
judge these people, right? Like,
yep,
is Napoleon saved? Well, if I can make my guesses, and I would guess probably not, as C.S. Lewis did, by the way. C.S. Lewis puts him in hell in The Great Divorce.
yep,
Uh, but on the other hand, it's also not my call.
yep. So like Magellan. He clearly had, there's some very clear evidence that he respected the things of Christianity, but there's also plenty of evidence that he was a pirate and he lived for the plunder and the adventure. These are like, to be a great man is often to not be a simple man. In the same way that I spend much of my time, um, living in the world, but also seeing how my actions affect others, I don't think Magellan would think anywhere close to the same way I would. For the simple reason, there's no profit in it. It will not enrich him, it will not make him greater to worry over much about other people. Plus,
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, finish what you're saying.
everyone else like Cortez and Pizarro are coming home with immense riches. Shouldn't he get some of that? Like it's like like there's a like post Reconquista, you have a warrior culture and no great enemy to fight because Morocco was kind of its own thing and part of several civil wars and a bunch of other stuff that went on at the same time. So what do you do with them?
Uh,
Hmm?
yeah, Cortez is worth talking about one day in his own right, because I would
Oh yeah,
argue that he is one of the greatest of all of them, and it is very, very unfortunate what people have done to the reputation of the conquistadors in the modern day. Because like I would make the argument, and I will it's one of those those hills that I'll die on, is that Cortez was a freaking hero.
oh yeah,
Like he Cortez was a great man in both senses of the world. He was a good man and he was a great man. And like, did he make mistakes? Yes. But did he do the right thing for the right reasons? Also, yes.
Yep.
Like, I'm, pro Hernan Cortez here.
Hernan
Pizarro,
Cortez
ironically,
stands.
yeah, Pizarro, ironically, I would not make the same claim, even though the Incan Empire was in many ways almost as bad. Not quite as bad, because almost nothing's as bad, but almost as bad as the Aztecs.
Yep.
Uh, so even though, but I wouldn't make the same claim about Pizarro. So I want to be clear here. Like, I'm not just saying this because I hate the Aztecs. This is a positive appraisal of Cortez specifically.
Yep.
Like, uh, Pizarro too took down he did something great in taking down a terrible empire with like 13 people or something insane. And that is very impressive, but he was not a good person.
No.
Uh, like in any sense, nobody liked him. He was a very impressive person. I think you can make the case he was a great man in the sense that we're using it, somebody who accomplished great things. He was not a good person. So when I compliment Cortez, like, that's in the context of if I didn't think he deserved it, I absolutely would hold back, and I'm not. Like,
Yeah.
he deserves the credit that he gets. Anyway, though, thank you for the presentation.
Yeah. I do want to say for Pizarro, like, supposedly, when he died, he took the blood he was bleeding, made the sign of the cross on the floor, and kissed it. Uh,
Well, that's a good sign for his immortal soul, I suppose.
I guess, but also it was during a mutiny, and he had been acting in like it's one of those things. I don't use whenever I say pirate. There are pirates which are to be mocked and ignored and to be called bad things, but when I say piratical spirit, or a freebooting spirit, I don't mean. Um, I'm basically saying they aren't feds is what I'm saying. That these are free men having adventure, choosing booty and plunder, maybe fighting for a good cause, maybe fighting for a bad cause, but certainly, fighting and being active in the world. That's all I wanted to say, Anthony. I will let you take over.
Fantastic. So I linked you my presentation if you want to show it on screen, but you also don't really have to because it's notes for me as well. Uh, yeah. So I No problem. While you're doing that, since the first slide is literally just the name Yisun Sin, I'll explain myself a little bit. So, I decided to do my presentation on Yisun Sin, and he is a man who, ever since I learned about him, it always was one of those people like, how is he not more famous? Well, the answer to this is he is more famous. Yisun Sin is a legend in Asia. Uh, in the Koreas, specifically the Koreas, like we'll get there. In the Koreas, in China, in Japan, in that area of the world, Yi Sun Sin is a household name. He would be something I think the closest analog I could think of in the United States to the hold he has on their imagination. Thank you, I could see that's up. Okay. So when I start talking about the next slide, just go on. Uh Yi Sun Sin has the hold on the imagination in Asia as Patton does in the United States. Like, that's the closest thing I can think of. And Patton, it's arguably not entirely deserved. Yi Sun Sin, it is inarguably entirely deserved. Yi Sun Sin is probably the greatest naval commander in the history of warfare. He is arguably the greatest military commander in the history of warfare, and almost inarguably the greatest naval commander. Uh, Even the great British naval commanders, I can't remember his name. Oh, Horatio Nelson, maybe. Uh, Thank you. Yeah, even Nelson, like Nelson, deferred to Yi Sun Sin when they compared the two. Uh, and correctly so, in my opinion. Uh, so he is an extraordinary person. Now, to get into who he was, and also, by the way, as I go into the next slide, he Yang Gwen Lee of Legend of the Galactic Heroes, there is a 100% chance he is at least partially based on Yi Sun Sin. Everything from the name to you'll start to see the similarities as we go through this. Like the two, Lowengram of Legend of the Galactic Heroes does not have a direct one-to-one analog. There are similarities with Alexander the Great and Hannibal, uh, but Yang Wen Li, like he is based on Yi Sun Sin, and you're gonna see why. So the background of this: Toyotomi Hideyoshi, I think I spelled that right, Hideyoshi, had recently united Japan. He wanted to conquer Korea and China. This is an extremely basic background, but I hate to tell you this, Japanese stans, but there is really no other way to talk about this. Like, why did he want to conquer Korea and China? Because they were there, and he thought he could. Uh, the Joseon Kingdom of Korea saw this coming, but could do little to stop it. So at this point in time, a little bit of background on the Joseon Kingdom. They were like a late stages empire, kind of, or a late stages kingdom. They were very corrupt, and they were corrupt in almost modern sense, where they were corrupted by bureaucracy, right? Many, many layers of bureaucrats and things. They did have a king. He will come up in the story later. But it was the bureaucracy of the government that really made it corrupt. So many backstabs and things. So Yi Sun Sin was the head of the Korean Regional Navy, or at least a portion of it at the beginning of the war, but effectively, he becomes head of the Navy very, very quickly. At the time the war began in 1592, he had cut his teeth in the army, and in fact, he had never commanded a naval battle in his life by the time the war started. Now, that sounds a little bit unusual, but I want you to think about this for a moment. Like, think about if a war started now, how many of our commanders would just have never commanded a battle, especially if you were in the Navy? Like, it's not that unusual. Uh, he already had a reputation for genius. So, Yi Sun Sin, his background. This is next slide, by the way. Uh, the kingdom of Joseon, much like Hannibal's Carthage, and there are parallels between Hannibal and Yi Sun Sin. Or I'm sorry, this is a typo. Yi Sun Sin. Whatever. The U and the I, reverse it. Yi Sun Sin. The kingdom of Joseon, much like Hannibal's Carthage, did not deserve Yi Sun Sin. There's a parallel here in that Hannibal was a man who was both good and great in a way that his society did not understand and rejected. Yi Sun Sin is similar. Now we shall see how this ends, however. Uh, they were terrified of him. And the reason they were terrified of him is that he had two things going for him that made him very scary if you are a government in decline who is paranoid of everyone around you. He was incredibly intelligent, a genius, in fact, and he was incredibly popular. So, even before he became head of the Navy, the government repeatedly attempted to sabotage him because they were terrified his combination of genius and charisma would lead to him seizing power. Before the war began, he had been framed falsely for desertion, stripped of his rank, and made into an infantry soldier and tortured. This was common in the kingdom of Joseon. This was just a thing that they did. But his genius was so great that in rapid succession he had worked his way back to the top ranks of the military and was head of the Joseon Navy, or again, like a portion of it, but that doesn't last long, when the war began. I'm skipping large chunks of time. There's, a story that he left the army for 3 years when his father died. He was actually very old for a junior officer. He was like a 29-year-old junior officer, which was considered old in Korea at the time, but none of that's really important to the story. So we're gonna get to the genius of Yi Sun Sin, which is next slide. Uh, so again, typos. I apparently at one point as I was writing this, I just reversed the name. Oh well. You know who it is. So Yi Sun Sin's genius legitimately cannot be overemphasized here. He was literally one of the most forward-thinking military commanders in the history of warfare. Like, there are not enough superlatives that you could put on this man. At every aspect of war that you could think of, he was a genius. Japan was stronger than Korea, and by all rights should have won the war easily. Their army ripped through Korea, and only the intervention of Ming China, who correctly realized that Japan was coming for them next, so knew that like it would be prudent if they got involved now, prevented the war from being ended immediately. That and Yi Sun Sin's Joseon Navy. Now, I'm fudging the details a bit here. I said that Sun Sin invented the ironclad battleship. That isn't technically true. Like, the prototypes had existed beforehand. What he did was he saw the prototype, said, hey, wait a minute, this could work if you make a few adjustments here and there, made those adjustments, and came out with what was called the turtle ship. So the turtle ship was the first commonly used in battle ironclad battleship. It was the reason in the early part of the war he was able to win so many battles despite being consistently outnumbered and outgunned. Or so people thought. We'll get back to this. So, the turtle ship, which to be clear, even if that is what happened, like he invented it, or at least he is the person who was responsible for its use, uh, is the reason that he's winning in the early part of the war. So, next slide. Yi Sun Sin did not lose ever. He never lost. Now, early on, the Joseon Navy was numerically superior to the Japanese Navy. This is because the King of Korea had correctly, I think, realized that their army was going to be no match for the Japanese army. So he thought they might have a shot against their navy if he just overloaded with as many ships as he could. So they had a bunch of ships, and they had the home field advantage, which is important in warfare, but they were constantly undersupplied and understaffed. Sun Sin's charisma was critical in maintaining morale, and he was known as an extremely charismatic person. It's a good time to mention the character of Yi Sun Sin. It looks to me like if you're going to place him on the socio-sexual hierarchy scale, it's kind of hard to place him, but he strikes me as beta in that scale. So we're talking about the alpha or bravo is how it's referred to now. The alpha bravo uh, delta gamma omega sigma scale. Sun Sin strikes me as bravo. And you'll see why a little bit later. But he fought with his men, so this is another similarity to Hannibal. Like Hannibal, he is fighting for a government that does not deserve him. He is a better man than his army, and uh, like Hannibal, he always fights with his men who adore him. So Hannibal never had to deal with a mutiny, despite the fact that he fought overseas for almost 20 years and uh, was dealing with an army that was largely made up of mercenaries. Well, Yi Sun Sin was able to maintain morale and maintain the respect of his men despite being constantly undersupplied and outgunned by the Japanese Navy because his men adored him. He would even sometimes go out of his way to fulfill his men's dying wishes, which just goes to show like the character of Yi Sun Sin as well as the genius, because maintaining the morale in a war like this is crucial. The biggest factor in Yi Sun Sin's success, and we're going to see this later in a big way, was his encyclopedic knowledge of the extremely complex coastline surrounding Korea. He would manipulate the battles in these really complex and creative ways and force victories in these impossible situations. So, next slide. Disaster strikes. Now, I know that it seems weird we're getting to disaster, but like, here's what you need to know about the early part of the war. He runs 4 campaigns. He is phenomenally successful. Like, he does not lose a single battle. He dominates all 4 campaigns, and he essentially like he is the reason that the Japanese don't just roll over in the war. It's a stalemate. It's a stalemate because of Yi Sun Sin and because of the Ming Chinese army kind of stopping the Japanese advance. And the Japanese can't properly resupply themselves and they can't bring in more men because Yi Sun Sin is preventing their navy from gaining any sort of foothold. Uh, right? He wins 4 campaigns. He's now the head of the Korean Navy, and then disaster strikes. And I cannot believe the next part of the story is actually real. Like, I want to emphasize this. It is so insane. Uh, so after winning 4 major campaigns against the Japanese, never losing a battle, Emperor Hideyoshi realized he would not be able to win the war with Yi Sun Sin alive. So he comes up with a plan where he introduces a double agent named Yashira into the Joseon imperial government. This is real. This really happened. It works. He convinces the Koreans that he is a double agent for their side. One day, Yoshira tells a high ranking Korean general that a certain Japanese admiral would be attacking at a certain spot, and Yi Sun Sin was ordered to wait in ambush. And this is where my admiration for Yi Sun Sin truly kicked into high gear. Uh, Yi Sun Sin knew about this, and he refused the order. He refused the order for 2 reasons. First, he knew the area was extremely dangerous for ships, being littered with sunken rocks. And second, he did not trust spies. But he knew. So, like, I really want to emphasize this that a spy was ordered in to trick him into an ambush. He was ordered into his ambush by a higher ranking officer, and Yi Sun Sin said, I'm not doing it, it's a trap. And he was right. He was completely correct. He somehow knew about the trap. So, Gisun Sin responds to correctly noting that they were being set up. This is next slide, by the way. That they were being set up by a spy was to what he was arrested, he was imprisoned, he was tortured, and he was removed from command. The king wanted him killed, but his friends in the court convinced him to spare his life. So, for the second time in his life, Yi Sun Sin was demoted to the rank of a common infantry soldier. Both times for crimes he did not commit. Once it was for a bogus charge of desertion, entirely made up, and this time it was for correctly noting that a spy was setting them up, but refusing the order. This is considered the height of dishonor and arguably a fate worse than death. But Yi Sun Sin was loyal and obedient to the kingdom. He went about his work quietly and respectfully, though all knew he had done nothing wrong. Supposedly, he was treated with great respect by the men around him, because they knew that the whole thing was garbage. So, again, parallels to Hannibal, you have a government not supporting the geniuses around them because they don't know what to do with them. Uh, Next slide. Chilchon Ryang. I hope I pronounced that right. Chilchon Ryang. The Korean Navy without Admiral Yi Sun Sin was truly nothing. It was nothing. Hideyoshi was completely correct. We're on the next slide, by the way. Uh, they fought at a. Oh, I'm sorry. Nope, no problem. I'm just making sure that you heard me. They fought at a battle known as the Battle of Chilchon Ryang. There's backstory here to get to it, but I'm not going to go into all of it. Long story short is that this was an ambush. You know, the sort of trick that Yi Sun Sin had anticipated. So, like, I mentioned this just to point out that I highly doubt that Yi Sun Sin would have fallen for this. That led to the entire Korean Navy getting utterly decimated, like completely destroyed, and Won Gyun, Yi Sun Sin's replacement, getting killed. The Joseon Navy, which had, remember, like 1,000 ships or something, was left with 13 ships. And all of Sun Sin's turtle ships were destroyed. Next slide, which I have titled Panic. Because I'm basic. Korea panicked. Yi Sun Sin was hastily put back in charge of what remained of the Navy, if you could even call it that, and things were, you might say, grim. On land, they had little success, and that success was due to the aid of Ming China. The sea was the only reason the war was even able to be maintained. Like, it was so bad, the king seriously considered just surrendering, figuring that they had no navy. Like, there was just no navy anymore. They had 13 ships. The Japanese had hundreds of ships, and they had 13 ships. But Yi Sun Sin, in response to the king considering surrender, was one of the most badass lines in the history of warfare. This was in a letter to the king. Your servant still doth have 12 warships under his command, and as long as he is still alive, the enemy shall never be safe in the West Sea. Okay, that's an amazing line. And this leads to like the pressure, though. The pressure of that line. We're on the next slide. The Battle of Myeongyang. Uh, so, Battle of Myeongyang. This is the moment where men turn into legends, right? Like, this is where you separate the two of them. On the Japanese side, you have 300 ships, about 100 of which are warships. The other 200 are supply ships. On the Korean side, you have 13 ships, which I might add is the Navy. That's all of them. So, Yi Sun Sin had just boasted of his greatness to the king, right? Like, he needs to prove to the king and to the government that he is not talk. This is his moment. And Myeongyang was chosen for this battle very deliberately. It gets very complicated. Like the battle is really convoluted, and but that's intentional. The gist of it is this: the swirling waters around Myeongyang were incredibly convoluted and difficult to predict. Yi Sun Sin knew them perfectly and exactly at what time of the day the waters would swirl. He basically manipulated the Japanese fleet into particular currents at a particular time of day. Then, when the water changed, it left the Japanese ships trapped. 31 Japanese ships were destroyed in the battle, and Yi Sun Sin lost none. He predicted the exact movements of the currents perfectly and maneuvered the Japanese precisely where he wanted them to be at all times. He made not a single mistake. He almost didn't lose any men. I think he lost like 10 men or something absurd like that. Uh, this is considered by many people to be like the single greatest naval victory of all time. Uh, it's quite possibly the single greatest victory of any type in the history of warfare. You could certainly make that argument. Like, I cannot emphasize enough to you that this should have been impossible and would have been impossible for anyone else. And we know this because Yi Sun Sin was replaced. And literally, as soon as he was replaced, the Korean Navy was nearly destroyed. Like, this is the difference between Yi Sun Sin and everyone else. This is what separates men from legends. So, almost. You need one other thing, right? Uh, one other thing. You need to end it on a high note. So, the end. This battle completely turned the tide of the war. With the Japanese fleet somehow forced their retreat, they could not supply their army. Stalemated, an eventual retreat was inevitable. So the Japanese made one last effort to restock their army in Korea. They pretty much had no choice. It was this or nothing. They put together, and again, I'm shortening a lot here. They put together a massive army, right? Or a massive navy, I should say, to do this. Really huge navy. Uh, to restock their army in Korea. Yi Sun Sin anticipates this again perfectly because Yi Sun Sin appears to be able to anticipate everything perfectly. He combines with a Ming fleet to meet the Japanese. So remember the Ming Chinese are involved. Well, they still only have 13 ships. They're doing better now, but it's still not a very large navy. So he has to combine with the Ming fleet, led by Admiral Chen Lin. Though outnumbered as usual at this point of the war, in this case the Koreans actually had better technology and superior firepower. The fighting became desperate as this was the last shot of the Japanese to win the war. They actually boarded the flagship of the Ming Chinese, led by Chen Lin, and engaged in hand to hand fighting. But by dawn of the next day, the battle had been decided in favor of the Koreans. This is the Battle of New York Yank, by the way. I didn't write that down for some reason, but Battle of New York Yank. Uh, so, Yi Sun Sin's death. When he saw the Japanese retreating, Yi Sun Sin ordered a vigorous pursuit, knowing that if they crippled the Japanese fleet, they would end the war. So, basically, what's going on here is that if the Japanese fleet gets away, it's possible that they could restock and live to fight another day and make another attempt at it. But Yi Sun Sin smells blood. He realizes this could be it. Like, I could win the war here. So, he orders a vigorous pursuit. And during this period of the battle, he is shot and killed by an arquebus, an ancient gun. Uh, and these are his last words. We are about to win the war. Keep beating the war drums. Do not announce my death. His nephew wore his armor until the battle ended, maintaining the attack. At one point in the battle, they had to come in to rescue the main flagship of the Ming for a second time. When Chen Lin went to thank Sun Sin and learned he had died, he supposedly dropped to the ground and beat his chest, crying. This is from a Chinese admiral to do this, right? Like, that's the Ming, the Chinese. For a Chinese admiral to do this in the 1500s, no less, like, that's the level of respect and love that people had for this man. Uh, this battle effectively secured the war for the Koreans. That's how you ended on a high note. so just to top off the legend of Yi Sun Sin, in the final battle, effectively, like not literally, but effectively, the battle that wins the war, which he knows, like it's not like he doesn't know this. He knows. He dies in this battle, and his last words are, "We are about to win. Keep beating the war drums. Do not announce my death." And the Koreans win. The Japanese are locked in a stalemate on land. They have no way to supply their army. They invaded. There's simply nothing they could do. They have to retreat from Korea, and Yi Sun Sin is forever enshrined in the legends of Korea. So, final slide. What we can learn. Well, couple things to me, but honestly, like, it's almost not much, because, like Hannibal, Yi Sun Sin is a better man than his country deserved, right? That's the parallel to me between Hannibal and Yi Sun Sin. Both of them were great men. Both of them, in at least many ways, I'm sure Hannibal, because nobody in that time period is true has no blood on their hands, but both of them were good men in many real ways, right? Like they treated their men well. They had a sense of true honor. They were not corrupt. You know, in a world where there was corruption surrounding them on all sides, they were not corrupt. But unlike Hannibal, Yi Sun Sin won. Hannibal lost. Yi Sun Sin did not. What's the difference? So there's a couple things here. First, unlike when fighting Rome, it's hard not to see Japan as straight up the aggressors here. When we talk about the Punic Wars, there's really no good guy or bad guy. Carthage was horrible, but it's not like Rome was, but it's not like Rome was, I don't know. I don't even know what I would use as a parallel. They weren't exactly the good guys. It wasn't the good angels versus the fallen angels, I guess is how I would put it. Rome was also quite corrupt at that point, and quite vicious and quite cruel, and had many issues of themselves. Not Carthage was absolutely not the good quote unquote good side either, but there wasn't a good side in the Punic War or in the Punic Wars. In this case, it's kind of hard not to see the Japanese as in the wrong. Like, literally, the emperor decided to invade Korea because I probably could win. And this does make a difference to the people who are fighting, right? Like, this does matter
I mean,
on some
I'd
level.
I'd make a stronger argument that he's like, oh damn, I am not Nobunaga, and I have hundreds of thousands of fighting men who may not get paid. Hey, there's Korea over there. I can solve two problems at once.
I didn't really look into the Japanese motivation much because I just wasn't as interested in it, but you might be right.
I mean, I'm
Uh,
not saying that that is the motivation. I'm just saying that there's Hideyoshi wasn't a fool.
oh, well, first, he absolutely wasn't a fool because, as this war kind of proved, like, if not for Yi Sun Sin, he absolutely would have won. Like, there's no question that he was not a fool. In fact, he was quite brilliant. Like, he comes up with a plan that comes, like, within a hair's breadth of working. Like, he very nearly gets rid of Yi Sun Sin with some insane 5D chess move. Uh, which is kind of, which, like, I cannot emphasize enough. When I read that story, I was like, how is this real? That's insane. But, and there's also, like, as bad as the Joseon Kingdom was, and it was very corrupt. Like, remember, on no less than two occasions was Yi Sun Sin demoted to infantry soldier for crimes he didn't commit. Carthage was next level. Like, I don't mean to downplay Carthage. It was not only corrupt on a governmental level, it was corrupt on a societal and moral level as well. Uh, like, we found the mass graves of children.
Yep.
There's really, so that matters too. So I guess, like, in this case, I'm not sure if there's a true message to the life of Yi Sun Sin. I'm sure if you were Korean, they would probably point to the fact that he was loyal to the Korean kingdom even when they treated him badly. But I think that just goes to the character. Like, he knew that the government might be bad, but there are good people living here, who would suffer under the thumb of the Japanese, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, though, God places heroes in the world as examples to us, and Yi Sun Sin is that hero. Uh, like, I really don't. It's kind of weird to say, where it's like there is no fatal flaw in Yi Sun Sin, right? Like,
Right.
he had all of the traits that were needed for him to succeed, and lo and behold, he succeeded. I suppose, though, if you want to say, like, he had just enough to succeed. And I think that's where you could look at, like, Hannibal. The society, the world around him was just uncorrupt enough. Like, literally, he had friends in the court, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
if he had one less friend in the court, things don't end this way. You know, if he, earlier in his life, like, if things were just a little bit different, things don't end this way. But they weren't.
Yep.
Like, he was on that level. He was that level of a truly great man who, and I think he's the sort of great man that the government is going to love after he dies, right? He's a
Oh yeah.
hero to the Koreans now that he's dead. If he had lived, I'm not sure what would have happened to him. He quite possibly would have been killed. Maybe he would have had to do like Hannibal did and flee the country. Uh, like, that's a legitimate possibility. It was probably very convenient to the Korean government that Yi Sun Sin just so happened to die in that final battle, right? Like,
Yes.
it was, it very perfectly solved their problem. I also want to emphasize one of the reasons I picked him is how cinematic this man's life is. Like, you really cannot pick a better capper than in the final battle that wins the war. That is the battle that he dies. You have the image of the other admiral dropping to his knees and weeping in grief, of his nephew wearing his armor to drive the army forward. You have Yi Sun Sin and that line, which is still one of my favorite lines of all time. Your servant hath 12 warships under his command, and he is still alive. So the enemy shall never be safe in the West Sea. which is quite possibly one of the greatest single boasts in the history of warfare. Uh, yeah, MacArthur wishes. Mac- MacArthur wishes. Uh, and also, Yang Wen Li of Legend of the Galactic Heroes is definitely based on him. Literally, Yang Wen Li at one point. First, his name is Yang Wen Li. It's even kind of similar in structure. Uh, he is also outnumbered all the time against a much stronger invading force. He is under an incredibly corrupt government that at one point tries him for crimes he did not commit because they are worried that he's getting too popular. He still remains loyal to the government despite all of this. The difference is that Yang Wen Li, in one of the most disappointing beats of the show, in my opinion, is assassinated by terrorists,
Yep.
by like religious zealot terrorists in one of the more disappointing beats of the show. And Yi Sun Sin went out in a blaze of glory and actually won his war. Uh, Now, and I love and have talked about many times Legend of the Galactic Hero, so this is not a criticism of the show overall. It's not even a criticism of the ending of the show, which I actually think is quite good. Uh, it's just a criticism of that particular plot beat.
Well, it's the way I view it is that the first half is sort of Yang Win Lee versus Lohengrin, and then I think it's Lohengrin, right? The prince.
Yes, Reinhard von Lohengrin.
Yep. And then like once Yang Win Lee is dead, it's just like there's nobody to stop me from everything. Like he doesn't even need to talk about him that much. It's just yeah, I'm gonna win this. I'm gonna win everything. The only person who could have
Um,
truly stopped me.
Julian kind of rises up at the very end and manages to negotiate a peace treaty with him, so that there's a remnant of the Republic government by the time the show ends.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
but remnants. Uh,
the the point being, like, I'm criticizing that particular plot beat more than the show as a whole. Like, I actually
yeah,
don't even think the ending of the show is bad per se. Like, it's quite well done.
yeah.
Uh, I just didn't like. That's the shall we say, the blind spot of most Japanese media. Is he was killed by like religious zealot terrorists, and it just did not work for me like at all.
Yeah.
It really didn't work. And especially I sort of get it because the idea is like you want it to be a somewhat realistic idea of like the random things that can happen in war as well. But then you get to Yi Sun Sin, who really did die in the most cinematic way you could possibly die. Like, uh, he literally died like in the middle of the final battle. Uh, but yeah, it's
It's
kind of
good.
weird. It's like, what's the lesson of Yi Sun Sin's life? Well, I guess the lesson is sometimes God gives us heroes as examples, and Yi Sun Sin is that hero.
It's true. That's the reason why I like doing this series because we can talk about the greater stuff that, to be clear, God forged Magellan just like he forged Yi Sun Sen. Uh, you know, they were made in his image
Hmm.
as much as anything else is for the human race. So that means that that spark of greatness isn't as far from us as you might expect. It just is in the thing that you have. Uh, Fortune favors people in such a way to put you where you need to be. Magellan survived battles and all these other things that could have happened to him, scuppering his life. And then the same way, like you said, if Yi Sun Sen had one less friend in court, had one less ear of the emperor, he would have been dead long before his greatness would have truly shined. Uh,
Yeah, no, it really does sometimes come that close. Hannibal too. Like, I hadn't realized. I researched the Battle of Zama later. I always thought that the Battle of Zama was, which is the Hannibal's defeat, right?
yeah,
Uh, And I always thought that the Battle of Zama was kind of more of a one-sided battle, and I looked it up later, and I was very wrong about this. Like, I don't know what made me think that. Like, in the Battle of Zama, like, to summarize the end of that battle, so it's actually a really great structure for a story, incidentally, and maybe I'll do something like it one day. At the beginning of the battle, uh, Hannibal's elephants had like gone rogue at one point and accidentally driven off his left flank, and Rome's cavalry, or a portion of it, saw what was going on and then said that we should probably pursue this, right? And they did, because they're like, this is a stroke of incredible dumb luck that we should not let pass us by.
Yep.
So they did, and they left the battle for a while. So fast forward to the end of the battle, and at this point of the battle, like, it actually kind of looks like Hannibal has done it again. Like, he has manipulated the battle into such a state that he started the battle outnumbered, but now at this point they are evenly matched, except that the troops that Hannibal has left just so happen to be his most experienced troops, arguably the most experienced fighting force in human history. They had like 16 years of nearly undefeated campaigning under their belts
Yep.
versus an exhausted Roman line. So, like, at this point of the battle, it actually looked like Hannibal had kind of done it again. Like, he had pulled off another miracle, and then the Roman cavalry charges in out of nowhere and shuts it down. Like, those are the sorts of things that, the fates of empires turn, right? Like,
Yep.
what if the Roman cavalry hadn't come back? I mean, that had happened before. Like, literally, it had actually happened before, where a Roman force just left the battle and went to a nearby town and told everyone they won. This is real. Look this up. It was like either Trebia or Tressamene this happened in. It's very funny.
Yep.
They like fought their way through and then just kept going until they hit a nearby town, and then they told everyone there that they won.
Amazing.
Like, this could have happened with the cavalry. What if the cavalry had been killed in the fighting?
Yep.
Like, that also could have happened. Uh, what if they gotten lost? But that's not what happened. Like,
Yep.
it also goes to show, too, that these empires, when you're at the late stage of an empire like this, like the Joseon Kingdom was late stage, right?
Yeah.
The fact that they were that corrupt and they were able to do this to Yi Sun Sin on multiple occasions is a sign of this, because, like, anyone who could do that to a man like that, like, this is a late stage empire. Well, Yi Sun Sin, uh, or I'm sorry, the Joseon Empire, like, if Yi Sun Sin was not there, they would have lost the war.
Yes.
Like, it literally came down to this single person. There was no replacement. There was no other piece. Now, partially, this is because the empire was that fragile, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, they were that fragile that it had come down to one man.
Yeah.
Like, it's a scary thing when you get to that point. And Carthage was the same. Carthage was Hannibal, right? Like,
Yeah.
without Hannibal, there was no fighting Rome. There was no war. Hannibal was that war. It's an interesting thing when you get there, and I wonder if we're ever going to see like the U.S. enter that sort of state where, like, we have one great man left, and he is what we have to bank everything on. And sometimes, like in the case of Yi Sun Sin, it works out for a time. The
Yeah.
Joseon Empire, or the Joseon Kingdom, did not last forever.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm trying to see when it's ended. It was replaced by the Korean Empire in the 1800s. This war was in the 1600s, but it was in decline during like the last 200
Yeah.
years. Yeah.
Well,
Uh,
yeah. I mean, it's the problem is that I can't really see us hitting that. Like, this is gonna sound cheesy, but there's some pretty good evidence that Donald Trump may have been our last gasp of anything. Um, and with the way the war's going in Ukraine, and with this and the dollar doing its thing, like, there's maybe a great man could do it, but he's going to be a Sulla, not a Yi Sun Sen,
Yeah,
probably.
and it's a sad thing too, because it's like if our great man was Donald Trump, like I appreciate what Donald Trump did for us, and I genuinely do. To
Yeah.
the point where, like, I was kind of annoyed with watching Lila Rose in her interview telling everybody, like, "Oh, don't vote for Trump." Like, I would go, you do realize, like, Lila Rose, he's the reason Roe v. Wade was overturned. Like, what are you saying? Yeah. But with that said, when you compare the character of a man like Trump to the character of a Hannibal or a Yi Sun Sin, like it is a sad parallel that like
Yeah.
this is the man that we have at the end. Yeah.
It's just
And
I can't think of anyone else who has, power and influence and stuff like that and the will to use it. Like I know that there's some very very competent, people in certain armed forces, but at the same time they'll never be given the chance they need. We also saw what's happening in Brazil. There were several points during Bolsonaro's replacement that the army marched out to quell riots. All it would have taken is one general to say, I will keep the peace, and then simply become dictator to protect the republic. Like it's like there are tons and tons of opportunities in our modern world right now that could be taken by a great man like Yi Sun Sen and a great man like Magellan in his own way. For somebody who's loyal to the state or
hmm
adventurous enough to pursue that that next level that could save a culture, save a country, save a city. But instead, they didn't. And Luna, or whatever his name is, took power, and he's a communist. He was supported by communist unions, and things that, as I understand it, have gotten worse. But then we look at El Salvador and its president, who has arrested every single tattooed crook he can get his hands on. And to be clear, they get their tattoos through murder and rape and other horrible things. Um, so and they kill people who don't have tattoos. Like it's, having a tattoo in El Salvador is a clear statement of that you're part of the gangs. Um, and he crushed his the insane murder rate of El Salvador. Like there's examples for us in our modern age, but it's not in the great powers. Putin is a great man, but we have yet to see how he'll perish from this earth. Um, and to see whether he cements it and builds Russia for beyond his life, or if he'll be similar to Donald Trump and fail at the moment of decision. Uh, I my
yeah, the one I'm sorry, you finish what you're saying.
So my apologies to our listeners and to Anthony, but I am fading quickly. If you finish your
Sure.
statements, and we'll close up.
Yeah, this is the last statement anyway, because I do want to emphasize that looking at these stories of both Hannibal and Yi Sun Sin, it goes to show that the whole like the psycho-historical idea of history, which is really just the Marxist idea of history in sci-fi garb, uh, of history, like I mean that very seriously, like of history as this overwhelming force heading in a certain direction, you know, uh, it really shows just how foolish that is.
Yep.
Like, history turns on so little. And again, like,
Yep.
you mentioned it with Yi Sun Sin. Hideyoshi was no idiot. He correctly identified that Yi Sun Sin was the problem, and he came up with a plan to get rid of him that came within a hair's breadth of working. Like, it effectively did work. All he needed was to have was have the emperor not be convinced, was have one guy be a little quieter, was maybe have Yi Sun Sin say the wrong thing at the wrong time, and his problem is gone,
Yep.
right? And we see what happens without Yi Sun Sin, the Korean Navy, and which means Korea, they literally had nothing. He was their entire navy. like single-handedly, it was him.
Yep.
When he was gone, they could not win. They not only could not win, they got crushed. Like,
Yep.
and Hannibal too. Like, Hannibal effectively delayed the rise of the Rome for like a solid 15 years. Like,
Easy. Yeah.
yeah, but it was literally he prevented it.
Yep.
Him, not Carthage, Hannibal.
Yep.
Like, if anything, Carthage, I mean, I guess Carthage did do well to hold out for 9 months in the Third Punic War. Like, they held out for longer than Rome expected them to, but, like, they couldn't fight back. They had no way of fighting back without Hannibal. Uh, like, the world turns on a single person, and especially, I don't know of any near misses in Hannibal's case, though in 16 years of battle, I am sure there were multiple. Uh, but
He had to
in
carve out his
recent
own eye.
Did he really? I didn't even know that
Got an
story.
infection.
That's cool as hell. Uh,
Right. So
just say,
all the things that Anthony
yeah,
has been saying, and he has a sick ass eye patch. Just putting it out there, putting out the vibe that Hannibal is eye patched the entire time.
that's incredible. But yeah, just to end this, like, that's my main point here. That the history of the world, like, can individual men make a difference? Because on one hand, you don't want to say that men are that important, right? Like, there's that line at the end of The Hobbit, which is fantastic, when Bilbo says, "The prophecies came true after all." And Gandalf responds, "Of course they did. You didn't think you were that important, did you?" Or something along those lines, yeah. Uh, and Bilbo laughs and says, "Thank goodness," and gives Gandalf the tobacco jar. It's the same thing here, where it's like, on one hand, the world will keep spinning without you. But on the other hand, the fate of empires rests in such things
Yep.
as Yi Sun Sin's friend was just a little bit more convincing than that general that hated his guts.
And in the same way, sorry, was that
Yep, and that's where I will end it.
excellent? Excellent. Very good, Anthony. Very good. Very nice. Uh, yeah, and looking through these things, the reason why I always like this great man of history thing that we do is not because of some sort of strange, oh, we got to prop up some historical idea or whatever. The idea isn't in the great men. The idea is that actions and deeds of the men who happened to be here, who had the spirits to be great, struck out as God intended them to strike out, and performed deeds of renown without peer. Uh, while, no offense to you, Anthony, I assume Yi Sun Sen's exploits are heavily exaggerated for propagandistic effect. Uh,
It's possible. Who
the
knows?
the East Asian kingdoms are very, we'll say, liberal with what truth of any matter is. Um,
I will say this: his personal diaries are like available, and they're actually
really
like considered Oh yeah, they're one of the national like treasures of Korea. Is the
amazing,
diary? Yeah, his diaries. So, with that said, that doesn't mean they're not exaggerated, of course.
of course.
Uh,
But like but the truth of the matter that can be guaranteed completely without any reservations or ideas is that Yi Sun Sen, his actions defeated the Japanese. In the same way with Magellan, whatever they say, whatever his cruelty, whatever his piratical influence, the mutinies he had to put down, even though he did not see the end, Spain still completed the first circumnavigation of the globe. One of his ships left Spain and made it all the way, the Victoria,
yeah,
made it all the way around back to Spain the long way. And that's something much like Edmund Hillary and Everest and all the other adventurers who succeeded, and even some of them who didn't, this cannot be taken away from them. And I assume that God allowed these things to show us that not only can enemies of the physical realm be defeated by even the merest happenstance, but also that our spiritual dangers can be overcome or ignored such that we serve God the better and more heroically. So, when you raise your Jolly Roger, put a cross on it and hand out tracts to all the captured seamen who you're going to throw off the plank.
Just one thing.
Mm-hmm.
One day I want for maybe next Great Man, maybe a later Great Man if I come up with a better idea.
Yeah.
One day I want to do the first emperor of the Han Dynasty because his story is extremely funny. He was basically like, imagine just being a security guard. Essentially, he was a security guard
Right.
in the Han in the whatever the pre Han Empire was, which I can't remember right now,
Yeah.
Zhao or something. The pre Han Empire, and a few of his prisoners escaped. And when your prisoners escape, like the security guard is executed, so he figures he's screwed anyway. So he teams up with the other prisoners, and they like start a rebellion, and like they
Amazing.
go, and then things happen, and then eventually he becomes the emperor. It's like, you ever have such a bad day at work that in order to avoid getting fired, you need to overthrow the government and become emperor? It's like, because that happens.
It's true. I'll have to think up the next one I want to do. Because I've gone through Greece and then Spain. I think maybe I should do someone from England or something. I don't know. Be pretty sweet. Well, thank you guys for joining us. Next, well, we'll talk about it, and I'll tell Anthony what's going on, and we'll see. But we will have something for you next week. Have a good one.